My wife's business partner stared at me during the dinner, assumed I was a nobody, humiliated me in front of everyone, and spent the rest of the night wishing he had never opened his mouth. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. Ruben stared at me that night with that smile of someone who already knows who you are, who you're not, and what you're worth. He looked me up and down in less than 3 seconds, like those who are used to classifying people before greeting them. And then, in front of the whole table, in front of the partners, in front of the clients, in front of my own wife, he opened his mouth. It was the most expensive mistake of his life. I didn't know it then, but he spent the rest of that night wishing with all his soul he hadn't asked me anything, wishing he'd kept that smile hidden, wishing he'd chosen someone else to ridicule, because what he discovered that night, what everyone in that room discovered, wasn't what they expected. And what my wife understood for the first time in 11 years of marriage wasn't something I'd planned to reveal either. Not that night, not like that, not in front of everyone. But Ruben forced me. And when someone forces you to be who you truly are, the only thing you can do is be it completely. So I was, and the silence that followed was the longest I'd ever heard in my life. But I won't start there. I'll start where everything makes sense. With Maricella, with the woman who's been by my side for 11 years without really knowing who she married. Not because I lied to her, but because I never found a way to tell her without it sounding like something I'm not, without it seeming like I was showing off, without it changing the way she looked at me. That simple, honest way I love so much in her. Maricella is an architect. She spent 15 years building her career with a discipline few people have. I've seen her get up at 5 a.m. to review plans before I finish my coffee. I've seen her come home at 11 p.m. with tired eyes, but with that spark intact, the one she has when a project truly excites her. She doesn't work out of obligation. She works because she loves what she does. And that, in a world where most drag their feet to the office, is something I've always admired in silence. When she opened her own studio 4 years ago, I didn't sleep well for weeks, not because I doubted her, but because I know what it costs to build something of your own. I know the weight of putting your name on the door and betting everything that it'll work. And I'd see her come home with that mix of exhaustion and satisfaction that only someone who's building something real, something of their own, has. And I'd look at her and think, this woman doesn't need anyone to open doors for her. She builds them. I never told her that in those words. That's just how I am. I keep important things to myself. Not out of coldness, but because some things are better said with presence than with words, by being there, by showing up, by being consistent when everything else fails. And I was always there during the difficult nights, during the complicated decisions, during the times when the studio faltered and she doubted. There was Hernan, the silent husband, the one who doesn't talk much in meetings, who arrives in simple clothes and doesn't make flashy comments. The one who, if you run into him on the street, you wouldn't imagine he could be anyone important. That's me. Or at least that's what people see when they look at me. And for many years, that was enough for me. It was enough to be invisible. It was enough that Maricella knew she could count on me without needing the whole world to know it too. I never cared for noise. I never cared for appearances. If I learned anything in all these years, it's that real money doesn't make noise. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. And people who truly have something to offer rarely feel the need to prove it at a dinner. Ruben hadn't learned that yet, and that night, in front of everyone, he was going to learn it the hard way. But it was still a little while before that moment. First, the invitation had to arrive. First, that dinner Maricella mentioned to me on a Tuesday night, almost in passing, while she was reviewing some documents at the dining room table, had to arrive. She told me Ruben had organized a dinner to celebrate a new contract, a big project, the biggest the studio had gotten since they opened. She told me it would be at a central restaurant, that some important clients would be there, and that she'd like me to accompany her. She told me, with that quiet voice she has when she doesn't want to pressure, but deep down, she expects me to say yes. And I said yes. I didn't think too much about it. Maricella matters more to me than my social discomfort. And if she wanted me there, I was going to be there in my usual clothes, with my usual silence, without preparing any speech, without planning anything. I never planned what happened that night, it just happened. Ruben wasn't the type of person who goes unnoticed. I understood that from the moment he walked into the restaurant that night. He didn't arrive, he appeared. There's a difference. Arriving is simply being there. Appearing is making everyone notice without you having to say anything. And Ruben knew exactly how to do that. He walked in with his jacket perfectly fitted, his hair neatly combed with that precision that costs money or time or both. He greeted the first people with a firm handshake, one of those that says, "I'm here and I'm important," without needing words. He smiled easily, with that naturalness of someone who's practiced so much that it no longer seems practiced. And he scanned the room with his gaze like someone who's used to being the center, checking that everything was in its place, that everyone was in their place. I was sitting next to Maricella with a glass of water in front of me, observing without anyone observing me. That's how I usually am at these events, present but invisible, attentive but quiet. It's a position I know well and that over the years I've learned to value. From there, you see everything. From there, you understand who everyone is before they open their mouths. Ruben, for example, took less than 10 minutes to show me exactly who he was. It wasn't rude, it wasn't a direct insult, it was something more subtle than that. And precisely because of that, it was more revealing. It was the way he greeted each person at the table. With the clients, effusive, warm, full of attention. With the studio partners, respectful, professional, egalitarian. And with me, when Maricella introduced me, he was cordial in that particular way certain people have when they don't quite know what to do with someone who doesn't fit into any of their known categories. He extended his hand and looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Not with hostility, with evaluation. Like when you open a door expecting to find something and you find something else, and your brain needs an extra moment to process. Maricella said, "I'd like to introduce you to Hernan, my husband." And Ruben said, "Of course, the famous Hernan. Maricella talks a lot about you." He smiled. I smiled. And he'd already decided who I was before I said a single word. I noticed it in how he immediately diverted the conversation to someone else. I noticed it in how, during the first 20 minutes, his eyes passed over me as they would over a piece of furniture, without stopping, without curiosity, with that calm of someone who's already classified and closed the file. I didn't say anything. I drank my water, listened to the conversations, and observed. The dinner started with the rhythm these meetings have when there's money and ambition at the same table. Everyone talking about projects, contracts, figures, trends in the real estate market. Ruben led the conversation skillfully, I've got to admit that. He knew when to talk, when to pause, when to throw out a fact that would impress without seeming like he was trying to impress. He was good at it, genuinely good. Maricella participated with that quiet confidence she has when she's in her element. I look at her occasionally and think the same thing I always think, that she's the most capable person I know when it comes to her work. She talked about design, structures, aesthetic and functional decisions with a clarity that made everything seem simple, even if it wasn't. The clients listened attentively. Ruben looked at her with that genuine respect partners have, who know the other is indispensable. And I was still there next to them, in silence with my glass of water. It was during the second course of dinner when Ruben decided, for some reason I don't fully understand yet, to include me in the conversation, or rather, he decided to use me as part of the conversation. There's a difference between those two things, too. There was a moment when the topic turned to investments. One of the clients, a man in his 50s with a face that had seen many economic cycles, made a comment about real estate investment funds and how they were moving the market. At this point, Ruben took the opportunity to talk about a specific project he had in mind, something big, something that required significant capital, and he mentioned in passing that he'd been trying to approach certain funds without much success. And then he looked at me. I don't know why he did it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was that impulse certain people have to include the quietest person at the table at the moment they least expect it, as a form of social entertainment, like a small test that everyone will witness and whose outcome they already know. He looked at me and asked with that comfortable smile he'd had all night, "And you, Hernan, what do you do for a living?" A simple question, for words, but it wasn't a real question. It was a classification disguised as a question. It was the polite way of asking what level you're at to know how to treat you the rest of the night. I know because I know that question. I've heard it hundreds of times at dinners like that, and I know exactly what comes next depending on how you answer. If you say something impressive, the conversation opens up. If you say something ordinary, the conversation closes with a polite smile, and no one speaks to you again until it's time to say goodbye. I replied with what I always reply when I don't feel like explaining anything. I said, I work in investments. Ruben nodded with that expression people have when they process an answer that tells them nothing, but that they're also not interested in delving into a kind of okay, that actually means understood, not relevant. And then he did something I didn't expect, or maybe I did expect it, but I expected him to have a little more tact. He turned to the client who'd made the initial comment and with a slight smile said, "We all work in investments in some way, don't we?" And he let out a small laugh. The client laughed too. One of the other partners smiled. It was a second, less than a second, but it was enough. Maricella didn't notice, or if she did, she chose not to react. I know her well, and I know that in those kinds of situations, she prefers not to make a fuss about something that might seem minor. And technically, it was minor. Technically, it was just a comment, a small joke, the kind of thing that if you point it out, you look like you're overreacting. But I noticed it, and Ruben knew I noticed it, because for a fraction of a second, he looked at me directly with that quiet confidence of someone who's just done something and knows they're going to get away with it. I drank my water again, and something in me, something I normally keep very still, very hidden, very far from these situations, began to move slowly. It wasn't anger. Anger is noisy, and I'm not noisy. It was something else. It was that cold clarity that appears when you understand that the night is about to change direction and that you're the only one at the table who knows it yet. Ruben kept talking, the others kept listening, and I remained silent with my glass of water, waiting for the precise moment, because in 11 years of doing what I do, I learned something worth more than any title or any number in a bank account. I learned that the moment always comes, that you don't have to force it, you don't have to rush it, that the only thing you have to do is be ready when it appears. And I was ready. The restaurant had that atmosphere only places that know exactly what they're selling achieve. It wasn't ostentatious, it was precise. Warm lights on white tablecloths, crystal glasses catching the reflection of candles, conversations mingling at just the right volume, enough to create ambience without preventing you from hearing what was next to you. The kind of place Ruben chose because he knew it communicated something, that it said, without saying it, that the people sitting in those chairs belonged to a certain level, that it wasn't a place for just anyone. I'd been to that restaurant before, 3 times to be exact, twice for business meetings, once with Maricella for our 8th anniversary. I know the sommelier by name, but that night I didn't say anything about it. I sat down, ordered water, and let the ambience do what Ruben wanted it to do, classify everyone in their place. What Ruben didn't know is that places don't classify me. A long time ago, I learned to enter any room and feel exactly the same in all of them. Not because I'm arrogant, but because real security doesn't depend on the environment. It doesn't depend on who's looking at you or how expensive the tablecloth is. It depends on something internal that you either have or don't have, and that no dinner can give or take away. But that night, sitting across from Ruben, I remembered that not everyone has learned that yet. The conversation had continued after his comment. The topic of investment funds lingered on the table, like something unresolved, and Ruben picked it up with his natural ability to steer a conversation where he wanted it to go. He started talking about a specific real estate development, a high-end residential project in a rapidly appreciating area. He spoke of square meters, return projections, construction timelines. He did it well. He used numbers with the ease of someone who truly knows them, not someone who memorized them to impress. The clients listened with genuine attention. Maricella provided technical details about the design when Ruben asked her, and I listened to everything with that calm that people often confuse with disinterest, but which is actually the opposite. When you listen in silence, you hear everything, not just the words, but also what's between the words. And between Ruben's words, there was something that felt familiar to me from the beginning, the project he was describing, the characteristics, the area, the type of development. I knew it, not from having read it in some report. I knew it because it had passed across my desk, because someone on my team had analyzed it, because we had an internal conversation about whether it was worth it or not, and we'd reached a conclusion, but that wasn't the time to say it yet. I kept listening. Ruben reached the central point of his presentation with the timing of someone who knows how to tell a story. He said the project needed a significant capital partner, that they tried to approach some investment funds in recent months, that the process had been more difficult than expected, because these funds, he said with a slight smile, are closed worlds. They're structures that aren't easy to access if you don't have the right contacts or if you don't move in certain circles. And as he said that, his eyes scanned the table with that discreet satisfaction of someone who knows they're in the right circle, who knows that in that room, there are people who understand what he's talking about. His eyes passed over me without stopping. Naturally, as always. One of the clients asked which funds they'd tried to approach. Ruben mentioned some names, good names, real funds with a track record, with significant capital. He mentioned them with respect, with that tone people have when they talk about something they admire, but that they feel is slightly out of reach. And then he mentioned one more. He said it almost in passing, like an additional detail in a list, but I heard it perfectly because that particular name wasn't just any name to me. It was the name of the structure I'd helped build 12 years ago. The fund of which I'm a founding partner. The one that literally bears my signature on the articles of incorporation. I felt something strange at that moment. Not euphoria, not urgency, something more akin to absolute clarity. Like when you're in a dark room and someone suddenly turns on the light and everything appears exactly where it always was. I took a sip of water. Ruben continued speaking. He said he'd sent a formal proposal to that fund a few months ago, that it had been a long process with a lot of documentation, with preliminary meetings, with expectations, and that in the end the proposal had been rejected without too much explanation. He said it with that elegant resignation of someone who knows how to lose in public without breaking down, but beneath which, if you know him well, you can see it still hurts. The others at the table responded with sympathetic comments, that these processes are like that large funds have very specific criteria, that it's not always a matter of quality, but of timing. Maricella also nodded and looked at me for a second, that quick second couples have to say things without words. Her look said something like, "Poor thing, it went badly for him." I held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at my glass, because what I knew at that instant was something no one else at that table knew. And what I felt wasn't superiority, it was something more complicated than that. It was the particular discomfort of someone who has information that completely changes the meaning of a conversation and has to decide in real time what to do with it. For years, my answer would have been simple. Nothing. Keep quiet. Let the conversation take its course. Go home with Maricella. Tell her privately if anything, and move on with my life. That's what the usual Ernan would have done. The discreet, the invisible, the one who feels no need to prove anything to anyone at any table. But that night, something was different, and the difference wasn't in me, it was in Ruben, because Ruben wasn't finished. With that glass of wine in his hand, and that confidence that had accompanied him all night, he decided to do something that definitively changed the course of the dinner. He addressed the table in general with that tone of someone about to say something funny, something that would lighten the mood, something seemingly harmless. And he said, "Of course, with these funds, you never know. Sometimes you wonder who exactly the people making these decisions are, because clearly they're not people from this world." He gestured broadly at the table, smiling. "Here, we know what we're doing. There, who knows?" There were laughs, light, comfortable, the kind that accompany a comment that's not entirely serious, but not entirely a joke either. And then he looked at me directly with that smile still on his face, and added with a lightness that tried to seem casual, but had an edge, right or not? "You who work in investments of those mysterious things." More laughs, fewer than before, but enough. Maricella didn't laugh. I felt her tense, slightly beside me. She knows me well enough to know that something in me had changed, even though nothing visible had changed yet. I was still as calm, with the glass in my hand and my back straight. But something had changed. And Ruben, who was smart in many ways, wasn't smart enough to notice it yet. I looked at him directly for the first time all night with complete attention, without averting my eyes, without the automatic courtesy of pretending I hadn't heard or that the comment wasn't directed at me. I stared at him, and something in my expression must have changed because I saw his smile hold for a second too long. That second smiles have when the brain behind them starts recalculating something, but doesn't quite know what yet. I placed the glass on the table calmly, without noise, with that slowness that isn't clumsiness but absolute control of every movement. And for the first time all night, I spoke in more than monosyllables. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my tone. I didn't make any dramatic gesture that would announce what was coming. I simply spoke with the same calm with which I'd been sitting all night, with the same tranquility of someone who doesn't need to prepare any entrance because they've been exactly who they are for years, regardless of where they're sitting or who's looking at them. And what I said changed everything. Not suddenly, not with an explosion, but in that particular way things change when they're true and precise and arrive at the exact moment no one expects them. The entire table felt it. Ruben felt it first, and Maricella beside me unconsciously held her breath. What I said wasn't a speech, it wasn't a prepared statement, it was something much simpler than that, and precisely because of that, it was much more powerful. I said, "I know that fund you're talking about, Ruben. Quite well, in fact. Nothing more for now, nothing more." I said it with that particular calm of someone who isn't trying to impress anyone, but simply stating the truth, without unnecessary emphasis, without a calculated dramatic pause, like someone mentioning they know a restaurant or have read a book, with the absolute naturalness of something completely real. Ruben looked at me, and for the first time all night, something in his expression changed noticeably. It wasn't a big change, it was a micro-movement, that minimal adjustment a person's face makes when they receive information that doesn't fit the model they've already built. Like when a puzzle piece doesn't fit where it should, and the brain needs an instant to decide if the piece is wrong or if the model is wrong. He smiled anyway, because Ruben was the type of person who smiles while recalculating. It's a valuable social skill, but I was already seeing him from the inside. He said, "Oh, really? How's that?" And there was the question, the opening, the moment the conversation stopped being his and started being mine, even though no one at the table knew it yet. Even though Ruben himself still believed he was the one leading, asking questions, controlling the pace. I picked up my glass again, another sip of water, slow, unhurried, and replied, "I've been working with that fund for 12 years. I'm one of the founding partners." Silence. Not a dramatic movie silence, a real silence. One of those that lasts less than 3 seconds, but feels like much more, because in those 3 seconds, everyone at the table is processing the same information at the same time, and no one knows exactly how to react yet. Ruben was the first to speak, and what he said, how he said it, confirmed exactly what kind of person he was. He didn't say, "No way," or "You're kidding." Those would have been honest reactions. What he said was, "Well, what a small world," with a smile that tried to be warm but had tense edges, with that tone of someone who wants to appear interested in the information, not devastated by it. But his eyes weren't smiling. His eyes were making calculations at a speed his expression couldn't quite keep up with. I nodded without adding anything yet, letting the silence do its work. Silence is an extraordinary tool when you know how to use it. Most people feel it instinctively because it makes them anxious. I learned a long time ago to let it be, to let it extend until the other person feels the need to fill it. It was one of the clients who spoke first, a man who'd been listening attentively all night and who had that observant way of people who've built real things and know how to recognize others who've done the same. He asked, "How much capital does the fund currently manage?" A direct question, a business question. The kind of question you ask when the interest is genuine and time is valuable. I replied with the same directness. "We're close to $850 million in assets under management, with exposure primarily in residential and commercial real estate development in 4 countries. Another silence, different from the previous one, denser, more charged. $850 million is a number that changes the weight of the air in a room, Not because it's the largest number there is, but because it's specific enough to be real, large enough to be significant, and unexpected enough, coming from a man who'd been sitting silently all night, drinking water while everyone else talked. I noticed how the client nodded slowly with that gesture people make when a piece fits into a place where there was once a void. I noticed how another of those present at the table, a studio partner who'd barely exchanged words with me throughout the dinner, leaned slightly forward. An almost imperceptible but significant movement, the change in body posture when the brain recalibrates the level of attention someone deserves. And I noticed Maricella. Maricella was completely still beside me. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking straight ahead with that expression I know well, and that appears when she's processing something she didn't expect. It wasn't an expression of scandalous surprise. It was something deeper, quieter, and more profound at the same time. Like someone who suddenly understands the meaning of something that was in front of their eyes for a long time without fully seeing it. I wanted to touch her hand. I didn't. It wasn't the moment. Ruben took a long sip of his wine glass, and when he put it down on the table, something in him had changed, not dramatically, but enough for someone who knew him well to notice. His posture was the same, his smile was still there, but it had lost something, that particular lightness he'd had all night, that effortless confidence of someone who knows exactly where they stand and who stands beside them. Now, he didn't quite know where he stood, and what followed was in some ways more interesting than the moment of revelation itself, because Ruben tried to regain ground. He did it in the only way he knew how, with information, with data, with that professional competence that was genuine and that in other circumstances would have worked perfectly. He started asking questions about the fund, about the investment strategy, about the project selection criteria. The questions were good, intelligent, the kind of questions someone asks who understands the sector and wants to show that they understand the sector. But the tone had changed. It was no longer the tone of someone leading. It was the tone of someone trying to position themselves, of someone who feels they've lost something and is trying to get it back without it being obvious that they're trying. There's a huge difference between the two, and that difference is felt even if you can't explain it with exact words. I answered each question with the same calm with which I'd spoken from the beginning, without haste, without condescension, without any gesture that said, I'm enjoying this, although if I'm honest, something in me was enjoying it. Not out of cruelty, but out of that particular satisfaction of telling the truth at the exact moment someone expected you not to have it. At one point, Ruben mentioned his rejected proposal more directly. He said he'd like to better understand the criteria that led to that decision. He said it professionally, with that elegance of someone who knows how to ask without seeming like they're begging. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I said the proposal was solid in terms of design. Maricella and her team did a very good job on that part. I paused briefly. The problem was the financial projection for year 3. The occupancy estimates were optimistic for the risk profile we manage in that segment. Internally, we discussed it for almost 2 weeks before making the decision. The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones because in that silence, several things were happening at the same time. There was Ruben, who'd just understood that the man he'd overlooked all night was literally the person who'd signed the rejection of his proposal, who'd been sitting at his table drinking water in silence, while he made comments about mysterious investments and laughed at his own jokes. There were the clients who were recalculating the entire dynamic of the night in real time. There was Maricella, who remained still beside me with that expression I still didn't quite know how to read. And there was I, calm, with my glass of water in front of me, without having raised my voice at any point, without having made any aggressive gesture or any comment designed to hurt, simply having told the truth, with precision and at the moment when someone had, unknowingly, given me the perfect opening to say it. Ruben nodded slowly. He said, I understand, in a voice 3 tones lower than at the beginning of the night. And those 2 words, that I understand said in that way, were in some ways the most significant moment of the entire dinner. Not the revelation itself, not the numbers, not the silence, but that small, quiet, I understand from a man who just realized he'd made a significant miscalculation and was intelligent enough to recognize it. even if he wasn't humble enough to say it out loud. I looked at him for a moment longer, without triumph in my expression, without warmth either, and then I averted my eyes to the restaurant window. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, lights, movement, people who knew nothing of what had just happened at that table, and who wouldn't care if they did. That's also something you learn over time, that moments that feel enormous from the inside are completely invisible from the outside, that the world doesn't stop when someone finally sees who you are, that life goes on the same before and after these nights, but something does change. And that night, at that table, several things changed at the same time. Some for Ruben, some for those present, and one, the most important, for Maricella, because she was still silently beside me. And I could feel, without needing to look at her, that what she was processing at that moment wasn't about the fund or the $850 million or Ruben or the rejected proposal. It was about me, about 11 years of marriage, about everything she'd seen and hadn't seen, about everything I'd told her and everything I kept silent, about the question she hadn't asked me yet, but which I could already hear in the air between us, clear and calm like everything that truly matters. Why didn't you ever tell me? The dinner continued. That's how these things are. The world doesn't pause dramatically for important moments to breathe. The waiters kept bringing dishes. The glasses kept being filled. Conversations found new paths, like water flowing around an obstacle without stopping. And I returned to my usual place, present, calm, observing. But something had changed in the invisible architecture of that table. There's a particular physics to social gatherings, a distribution of energy that everyone feels, even if no one can explain it in exact words. It has to do with who speaks and who listens, with who asks questions and who answers them, with who occupies the center of the room without moving from their chair. Before I opened my mouth, that energy had a clear center, an axis around which everything else revolved. That axis was Ruben. After I spoke, the axis moved, not in a scandalous way, not in a way someone could point to and say, there, right there is where everything changed, but in that subtle and irreversible way things change when truth enters a room and settles in without asking permission. Ruben was still talking, still charismatic, still intelligent and articulate and socially skilled, but something in his energy had compressed, like a flame that's still lit but no longer has the same oxygen. He was still himself, but a slightly smaller version of himself. And that difference, invisible to anyone who hadn't been paying attention from the beginning, was completely evident to me. The clients looked at me differently, not exaggeratedly. Not with that uncomfortable reverence people have when they suddenly discover someone is important and don't know how to adjust the behavior they've already shown. It was something more discreet than that. It was the genuine attention that appears when someone stops being background and becomes foreground, when the brain decides, without you consciously ordering it, that it's worth listening to what that person has to say. One of them asked me about the market, about the trends we saw from our position, about what kind of projects seemed interesting to us at this point in the economic cycle. I answered honestly, without inflating anything, without using the unnecessary technical jargon some use to impress instead of communicate. I spoke as I always speak when the topic interests me, with precision and without embellishment. I said what I thought about emerging markets. I said where we saw real opportunities and where we saw risk disguised as opportunity, which is the most common and most expensive trap in the sector. The conversation flowed from there in a different way, denser, more real, with that particular weight that exchanges between people who are truly talking have, not simply filling time with words. And Ruben listened. That was the most revealing thing of all. Ruben, who'd led every moment of that night with the quiet authority of someone who always leads, listened, nodded, asked questions that were no longer for positioning, but genuinely to understand. The change was remarkable, not because it was humiliating, but because it was honest. And that honesty, that ability to adjust when reality requires it, told me something about him that the first 90 minutes of the night hadn't. That beneath the social arrogance there was something real, something worthwhile, and that if circumstances had been different, if we'd met in another way, perhaps the night would have had a completely different tone from the beginning. But circumstances had been what they had been, and we both knew it. At one point, during a natural pause in the conversation, Reuben addressed me with a directness he hadn't had before, without the protocol smile, without the light tone, with that quiet seriousness of someone who decides at a specific moment to stop acting and simply speak. He said, "Hernan, honestly, I'd like to have a more formal conversation with you at some point about the project, about what you saw in the proposal, not to reverse any decision, but to better understand what adjustments would make sense." I looked at him, and what came wasn't the man who'd overlooked me 3 hours earlier. It was someone who'd recalibrated, who'd absorbed the night's information, and who was consciously choosing to do something useful with it instead of simply licking his ego's wounds in silence. That requires a certain kind of intelligence, not the most common, but one of the most valuable. I said, "With pleasure. Next week I can make space in my schedule." He nodded, and in that nod, there was something that wasn't there at the beginning of the night, not gratitude. Exactly, something more akin to respect, the kind that isn't asked for and isn't given, the kind that simply appears when two people truly see each other for the first time. The dinner ended in the way these meetings end when they've been successful in their purposes, although not exactly in the purposes someone had planned, with conversations that linger longer than necessary, because no one wants to be the first to break the atmosphere. With desserts ordered without real hunger, with coffees that are pretext to stay at the table a little longer. I participated with the same calm, as always, without euphoria, without that accelerated energy people have after a moment of tension when the result was favorable. I was calm because I'd always been calm, because what had happened that night hadn't changed who I was. It had only changed what others knew about who I was. And that difference, which for others can be enormous, for me was simply an information update. Maricella spoke little during that second half of the dinner. She participated when spoken to directly, answered with her usual intelligence and clarity, but there was something different in her, a particular stillness I knew well, because I'd seen it before in other circumstances when something affected her deeply, but she chose to process it in silence before speaking. At one point, while the others were engrossed in a parallel conversation, she looked at me. She just looked at me, without saying anything, with those eyes I know better than anything else in the world, and which at that moment had an expression I didn't quite know how to classify. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride either. Or not just that, it was something more complex, something that blended several things at the same time, and that would need more than a look at a dinner to be completely resolved. I held her gaze, and all I did was touch her hand under the table slowly, without anyone seeing. She didn't pull her hand away. That told me more than any words she could have said at that moment. When we finally got up from the table, the goodbyes had a different tone than they would have had if the night had gone as Reuben had planned. The clients shook my hand firmly, with that attention in their eyes that indicates the conversation didn't end there, but simply paused. One of them asked me for a card. I told him I didn't usually carry cards, but that Maricella had my contact and could give it to him. Reuben was the last to say goodbye. He approached both of us, Maricella first, with that genuine warmth he'd had for her before, and that nothing that had happened that night had changed. And then he extended his hand to me. I took it. The handshake was different from when we arrived. The one when we arrived had been the handshake of someone who already knows who you are and quickly places you in their internal hierarchy. This was the handshake of someone who's starting to truly get to know you, slower, more present, with that direct eye contact people have when they're no longer acting. He said, "It was a pleasure, Hernan, a real pleasure." The emphasis on the word real didn't escape me. I said, "Likewise, Reuben." And I meant it because despite everything, despite the beginning of the night and the comments and the calculated smiles, what he'd shown in the second half was something that deserved respect, the ability to adjust, not to cling to error, to choose to learn instead of defending himself. That's not insignificant. We left the restaurant, just the two of us, Maricella and I. The night air was fresh, and the street had that particular stillness of late weekday hours, when the city's volume has quieted down but hasn't quite gone to sleep. We walked to the car in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, but that dense, charged silence couples have when both know an important conversation is waiting and neither wants to start on the street. Standing halfway, I stopped by the car. I looked at her. She was looking at me too, with that expression she'd had from the moment I'd spoken at the table, that mix I still hadn't been able to fully classify. And then she spoke, not with anger, not with the tone of someone about to demand something, but with that quiet, direct voice Maricella has when something truly matters to her, and she decides to go straight to the point. She said, "Since when?" Two simple, direct words, with all the weight of the world inside them. I looked at her for a moment before answering. I thought about the fun's 12 years, about 11 years of marriage, about all the dinners similar to this one, where I'd chosen silence, about all the times someone had asked me what I did and I'd answer with the minimum version, just enough so the conversation wouldn't go further. And I thought about her, about Maricella, about what she deserved to know, and what I'd decided for reasons that at the time seemed valid, not to tell her. I breathed slowly and told her, "Sit down, I'll tell you everything." We sat in the car, the engine off, the windows closed, the city outside continuing its rhythm, knowing nothing of what was happening inside that small, private space that suddenly felt like the most important place in the world. Maricella was turned towards me, not completely, but with that particular angle she adopts when she's truly listening, with her hands clasped in her lap, with that stillness she has when something matters so much to her that her entire body organizes itself around attention. I looked ahead, at the streetlights drawing circles of light on the wet pavement of that night, which had started to drizzle without either of us noticing while we were inside. I didn't know where to start. Or yes, I did, but it took me a moment to get there, because there are things you carry for so long that when the time comes to let them go, your body doesn't quite know how to do it. Not out of fear, but because it got so used to the weight that it no longer remembers what it's like to be without it. I started from the beginning, the real beginning, not the comfortable beginning. I told her that when we met 11 years ago, I'd already been working on the fund structuring for a year, that it was a project in which I'd invested not only money, but years of previous work of building relationships, of learning firsthand how capital really works when it moves in large volumes. And when I met her at that gathering of mutual friends where we both ended up in the same corner talking about things that had nothing to do with money or business, something in me decided almost instinctively not to mix the two. Maricella listened without interrupting. That's something I've always admired in her, the ability to listen without filling the silences prematurely. I explained that the decision not to talk about the fund wasn't a strategy, it wasn't a calculated plan to hide something from her. It was more like a reflex, one that came from previous years, from experiences that had molded a particular distrust towards people who change when they discover certain numbers. That I'd seen that too many times, people who treat you one way before they know in another way after. And that difference in treatment, that subtle modification in how they look at you and how they talk to you, always seemed to me like the loss of something worth more than any amount of money. With her, I didn't want that. From the beginning, from that first corner, in that first meeting, I wanted what we built to be about something real, about who we were when there was nothing external influencing the equation. And when we started dating, and then when the relationship became serious, and then when we got married, every moment I could have said something, I let it pass, not out of cowardice, but because every time I thought about it, I wondered what would change. And the honest answer was, I don't know. And I didn't want to find out. Maricella was silent for a long moment after that. Then she said, "What if nothing had changed?" She said it without accusation, without the sharp-edged questions have when they're actually disguised reproaches. She said it with genuine curiosity, with that direct honesty she has when the topic is important and she decides not to play games. I looked at her, I said, "That's what scared me the most, that nothing would change, because if nothing changed, it meant I'd carried this silence for no real reason, and that would have been much harder to process than the alternative." She looked at me intently, and then, slowly, let out a small laugh. Not of humor exactly, but one of those laughs people let out when something absurd and something deeply true arrive at the same time. She said, "Hernan, you're the most complicated man I know." I said, "I know." There was a brief, comfortable silence, The kind only people who've been together long enough to know that silence is also part of the conversation have. And then she asked what I knew she was going to ask from the moment we left the restaurant. She said, "How much?" Not with greed, not with that particular anxiety the question about money has when it comes from the wrong place, but with the quiet practicality of a person who wants to fully understand the situation she'd been living in without fully knowing it. I told her the truth, the real numbers, the fund's value, my participation, the assets, the structures, everything I'd kept in a separate compartment of our life together for 11 years. Maricella listened to every number without changing her expression, without her eyes lighting up in that particular way they do when information activates something other than genuine understanding. She just listened, processed, and when I finished, she nodded slowly, like someone confirming something she somehow already knew even if she didn't know the details. She said, "That explains some things." I asked her, "What things?" She said, "The way you handle difficult situations, the calm you have when there's pressure. I always thought it was just your character, and it is, but now I understand where that calm comes from. It's not just character, it's practice. It's having made real decisions with real consequences for a long time." I looked at her and felt something I didn't expect to feel at that moment. Not relief, exactly, something closer to gratitude. Because what she just described wasn't the rich man her husband turned out to be. It was the man she already knew, with an additional layer of context that made him more complete, but not fundamentally different. That was exactly what I'd hoped for and exactly what I'd feared confirming for 11 years. I said, "Are you angry?" She took a moment to reply, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was being honest with herself before being honest with me. That's also something I've always admired in her. She said, "I'm not angry, I'm processing." She paused. "There's a difference between hiding something to hurt me and hiding something because you were afraid of what might change. I understand the second. I don't celebrate it, but I understand it." I nodded. She said, "What I do need is that for now on there are no compartments. Not because I care about money, Hernan, but because 11 years is a long time to carry something alone when you didn't have to." These last words hit me in a way I didn't anticipate, because they were right in a way I hadn't fully considered, not from the angle of honesty or trust, which are the angles I've been looking at for years, but from another angle, from the angle of the burden. From the angle of what it costs to carry something alone when you have someone by your side who could have helped carry it. I never thought of it that way, and hearing it that way, with those words and in that voice, stirred something inside me that hadn't moved for a long time. I said, "You're right." 2 words, the same 2 words Ruben had said hours earlier, but with a completely different weight, because his came from the recognition of an external error. Mine came from something deeper, from the recognition of something that had cost me. Not just her or the silence I'd chosen, and that hearing her describe it to me from the outside, I suddenly understood had also weighed on me more than I'd admitted. The silence that followed was different from all the silences of that night. It was a clean silence, one of those that remain after something is said, and there's nothing to add because what was said was enough and true and complete. The kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled, but simply to be inhabited for a moment before moving on. Outside, it was still drizzling. The streetlights still drew their circles on the pavement. The city was still the city, indifferent and constant and beautiful in its indifference. Maricella leaned back in the seat, looked ahead, and after a moment said in that quiet voice she has when something amuses her, even if it's not the perfect moment for it to amuse her. "You know what's on my mind most right now?" I asked her what. She said that Ruben has been treating me for 4 years as if I were the valuable part of our partnership, as if I were the talent and he were the capital. And it turns out that all that time, the biggest capital in the room was the silent husband who ordered water and said nothing. She let out a small, genuine laugh, one of those that appear when the irony of something is too perfect not to acknowledge. I also barely laughed, but I did laugh. And in that shared laugh, in that small, real moment inside the car with the rain outside and the city around, I felt that something that had been slightly misaligned for 11 years was finding its correct place. Not dramatically, not with a visible change that someone from the outside could point to, but in that quiet, and profound way important things settle when they're finally said. I took her hand, she squeezed it, and I started the engine. We got home past midnight. The house was in that particular silence that familiar spaces have when you've lived in them for a long time and every corner already has accumulated meaning. The silence of the paintings we chose together, the silence of the kitchen where Maricella makes coffee at 5 a.m. before I wake up. The silence of 11 years deposited on every surface, in every object, in every habit that's no longer thought about, but simply happens. I took off my jacket, left it on a dining room chair as I always do. Maricella took off her shoes at the entrance, as she always does. And we both went to the kitchen, also as always, because after a long night, the kitchen is where we naturally end up without talking about it, without deciding it, as if that space had the property of decompressing things. I put water on to heat, not for coffee. It was too late for coffee, for something calmer. Maricella sat at the bar with her elbows resting and her head slightly tilted to one side with that posture she has when she's thinking about something concrete and hasn't finished resolving it yet. I watched her for a moment while waiting for the water to heat. I said, "Still processing?" She said, "I'm always processing, but now I'm processing something specific." I asked her what. She took a moment, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully. Maricella speaks that way, when the topic is important, with that precision she has when she wants to say exactly what she means and nothing more, nothing less. She said, "I'm thinking about all the times I worried about money without telling you anything. The first years of the studio, when we didn't know if it was going to work, when I had to decide whether to expand or maintain the size. I didn't sleep well for weeks. When we lost that big contract 2 years ago, and I thought we were going to have to cut back." She paused. "I never told you because I didn't want you to worry. And now I discover that you had $850 million in assets under management, and I was awake at 3 in the morning calculating if we could pay payroll." She said it without drama, without charged reproach, with that direct honesty that's her way of being when she decides to be completely honest. And it hit me with its full weight because I hadn't thought of it that way. At no point during those years had I connected the two worlds in that way. The world of the fun that I kept in a separate compartment, and Maricella's world with her studio and her worries and her sleepless nights. I kept them so separate in my head that I'd never made the simple calculation of what that separation meant to her. I sat across from her. I said, "If I'd known you were going through that, I would have done something." She said, "I know, but you couldn't have known because I didn't tell you either, and you couldn't offer because I didn't know you had something to offer." She paused briefly. We were both carrying things alone that we didn't have to carry alone for different reasons, but with the same result. I nodded slowly. I said, "Yes." And that word, that simple, unadorned yes, was perhaps the most honest thing I said all night, more honest than the numbers, more honest than the explanation in the car, because it acknowledged something I hadn't wanted to see, that my discretion, which I'd always justified as a way of protecting something valuable, had also had a cost, a real, concrete cost, measurable in sleepless nights for a woman who slept next to me without knowing she didn't need to be awake. The water heated. I prepared 2 cups. I put the exact amount of honey she likes in hers, which I know by heart, even though she's never told me out loud. Those things you learn unintentionally in 11 years of paying attention to someone. I placed it in front of her. She took it with both hands. We were silent for a moment, a silence different from all the others that night. Calmer, more hours, as if the kitchen and the hour and the accumulated tiredness had dissolved everything that wasn't essential and only what truly mattered remained. Maricella said, "Can I ask you something that might be a silly question?" I told her there were no silly questions. I always say that too, and I always mean it. She said, "Are you happy? With the life you have, with what you do?" I don't mean us, I know that. I mean your stuff, the fund, the work, that part of you I didn't fully know. Are you happy doing that? The question took me by surprise, not because it was unexpected coming from her, but because it was exactly the kind of question no one ever asks me. People who know what I do ask me about strategy, about markets, about decisions. People who don't know don't ask anything because they don't know there's anything to ask. but no one asked me if I'm happy doing it. I thought about the answer honestly, without the automatic reflex to say yes because it's expected, without the easy cynicism of saying it's just work, because that wouldn't be true either. I said there are parts that are. Building something from scratch has a satisfaction that's hard to describe if you haven't felt it. The moment a structure you assembled on paper starts to have real life. When the decisions you made 3 years ago produce concrete results today, that genuinely satisfies me. I paused. There are parts that aren't. The isolation that comes with a certain level. The difficulty of knowing for sure who's in your life, for who you are, and who's there for what you have. That's tiring in a particular way that doesn't completely disappear. Maricella looked at me. She said, "That's why you never told me. Not just out of fear that something would change between us, but because I was the only part of your life where that wasn't a problem." I never formulated it that way. But when she said it in those words and in that voice, I knew she was exactly correct. I said, "Yes, exactly that." She nodded slowly, and in that nod, there was something that was understanding, but also something more. It was that particular ability she has to see things from another person's inside, without losing sight of her own perspective, to understand without necessarily approving, to embrace a contradiction without artificially resolving it. She said, "I understand that. I truly understand it." Pause. "But Hernan, we've been together for 11 years. If at this point you're still afraid that what we are will change because of a number, then the problem isn't the number. The problem is that you don't fully trust what we built." That also hit me, softer than the previous one, but just as precise, because she was right, because the fear I'd carried for years wasn't really fear of her. It was fear of something older, something that came before her, and that I'd projected onto our relationship without fully examining it. I said, "You're right about that too." She said, "I know I'm right." And she smiled, that particular smile she has when she says something serious and softens it with humor at the same time. "I just wanted to hear you say it." I laughed genuinely, in that way that only happens when you're completely relaxed with someone, when there's nothing to defend or prove, and the only job you have is to be present. We stayed in the kitchen a little longer talking about small things after having talked about big things. That's how it works with us. Important conversations always end in something ordinary, something everyday that anchors everything prior to the reality of the life we share day to day. She told me something funny that had happened at the studio that week and that she hadn't had time to tell me. I told her about an investment decision I was evaluating and had genuine doubts about. We talked as we are, two people who know each other well and who, after an extraordinary night, chose to return to the ordinary because the ordinary is also valuable. Perhaps it's the most valuable. When we finally went to sleep, it was almost 1:30 in the morning. Maricella fell asleep quickly. She always does when she's processed what she needed to process, as if sleep was her body's way of confirming that everything is in order, that what needed to be resolved was resolved, and now she can rest. I stayed awake a little longer with the ceiling above and the quiet darkness of the room and Maricella's breathing beside me. I thought about Ruben, about his face when he understood who I was, about that small, quiet, "I understand," he said with 3 tones less volume than everything he'd said before. I thought that in other circumstances I might have been happier about that moment. I might have enjoyed the inversion of the dynamic with more explicit satisfaction, but what I truly felt at that moment, and what I was still feeling now, was something calmer than satisfaction. It was the confirmation of something I already knew, but that sometimes needs an external event to become visible again, that I don't need anyone to see me to know who I am. That the silence I chose for years wasn't weakness or fear at its deepest origin. It was the expression of an internal certainty that didn't depend on the validation of any room, or any table, or any look that would classify me from top to bottom before knowing my name. I knew that. What that night had taught me was something else, smaller and larger at the same time, that internal certainty is valuable, but sharing it with the right person doesn't diminish it, it multiplies it, and that Maricella was and had always been the right person. The days that followed that night were different. Not dramatically, not with visible changes that someone from the outside could point to and say, There, right there is where something changed. But in that quiet and profound way things change when an important conversation finally occurred and the air between two people becomes cleaner, lighter, as if it had been carrying a humidity that neither of them named, and that suddenly, without anyone opening a window, simply disappeared. Maricella got up that next morning at her usual time, 5:15, coffee, plans on the dining room table, the same routine as always. But when I passed through the kitchen on my way to the bathroom and saw her there with her cup in hand and her eyes on the documents, she looked at me differently, not radically different, just with an additional degree of something, of presence, of awareness. As if the image she had of me in her head had gained a little more definition during the night. And now what she saw was sharper than before, even though it was exactly the same person standing in the same place. She wished me good morning in that voice she is right after waking up, slightly hoarse and completely unfiltered. And then she said, without lifting her eyes from the plans, "Last night, I didn't dream of anything. I slept perfectly." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to say anything else, but I understood exactly what it meant. That something that had been active somewhere in her mind, something that perhaps even she herself hadn't identified as a tension until it disappeared, was no longer there. And that her body, which is always more honest than words, had registered it during sleep. I poured myself coffee, sat beside her, and we were silent for a while, both with our things, in that familiar quietness that's one of the most real forms of love when you've been with someone long enough. Not all love is said. Not all love is shown with visible gestures. An important part of love is simply this: two people who can be silent in the same room, and that silence feels like companionship and not distance. We had that before that night, and we still had it after, but now it had something more inside, a more solid foundation, a base that was good before and now was complete. Ruben called me 3 days later. I wasn't surprised. He'd said he would, and he was the type of person who keeps his word when it's convenient for him to keep it. He called in the mid-morning with that professional, calibrated tone people have when they want a conversation to have a specific register from the first second. He said he wanted to resume the idea of meeting, that he'd been thinking about what we'd talked about at dinner, about the criteria I'd mentioned regarding the rejected proposal, and that he felt there was room for a productive conversation if I was willing. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Ruben, can I make space on Thursday morning? An hour. Bring the updated numbers and the revised projections for year 3. If the work is done, the conversation is worthwhile." There was a brief pause on the other end, one of those pauses people have when they receive an answer that's more direct than they expected, but that deep down is exactly what they needed to hear. He said, "Perfect Thursday." And before hanging up, after a second of silence that he could have filled with anything and chose to fill with this, he said, "Hernan, the other night wasn't my best moment." He didn't say it with the tone of someone apologizing to close a file. He said it with the particular honesty of someone who found a way to say something difficult and chose to say it anyway, even if it wasn't mandatory. I listened and said, "It's fine. We'll talk about the project on Thursday." Nothing more. I didn't give the topic more space because it didn't need it, not because it hadn't mattered, but because it had already mattered enough at the moment it mattered, and extending it beyond that point wouldn't add anything to either of us. I hung up and held the phone for a moment. I thought about how strange the journey people take when a certainty they carried unquestioningly falls apart. Ruben had arrived at that dinner with a perfectly organized image of the world, with its places and hierarchies and silent but definitive classifications. And that image had shattered, not with violence, but with information, with the simple, concrete truth that the man he'd placed at the lowest level of the table turned out to be the person who represented the most capital in that room. That kind of rupture can go in two directions. It can generate resentment, that particular anger people have when reality doesn't match the narrative they've built, and instead of questioning the narrative, they question reality. Or it can generate something more valuable. The honest curiosity of someone who wonders what else they're seeing wrong, what other certainties they carry without having examined them. Ruben had chosen the second direction, at least for now, and that said something about him that the first part of that night hadn't. Thursday arrived with that fine winter rain that turns the city into something slightly calmer and slightly grayer. Reuben appeared at the office on time with a folder under his arm, and that contained energy of someone who comes to work seriously and knows it. Without the social lightness of the dinner, without the protocol smile, with something closer to concentration. I received him in the meeting room, not in my office. The meeting room has that neutrality that's suitable when the conversation needs to be about the work and not about the people having it. We sat down. He opened the folder, and what I saw immediately told me he'd done the work. The year 3 projections were revised, not superficially, not with a cosmetic adjustment that kept the optimistic numbers with another presentation, but with a real, substantiated revision, with explicit assumptions and developed alternative scenarios. Someone had seriously thought about what I'd pointed out at dinner and had rebuilt that part from the ground up. I looked at him, I said, "Who did this?" He said, "I did, with Alberto from my financial team." I nodded, and we started working. We spent almost 2 hours in that room, not 1-2, because the conversation deserved it. Because when the work is well done and the two people at the table are being honest about the numbers and the risks and the opportunities, time organizes itself around what matters and not around what was planned. Reuben was good. That became clear very quickly when the social context disappeared and only the work remained. He asked the right questions, absorbed information quickly, adjusted his position when the data warranted it without needing to defend every angle as if it were personal territory. That's rare, rarer than it should be. Towards the end of the meeting, when the numbers were on the table and the conversation had produced something concrete, something worth continuing with the correct steps, there was a moment of natural pause. One of those moments when the work is done, and before the goodbye begins, there's a small space that can be filled with anything or nothing. Reuben filled it with something I didn't expect. He said, "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with the project?" I told him yes. He said, "How do you do it?" The not needing people to know who you are. The being in a room where no one sees you and not feeling the need to correct it. The question was genuine, not rhetorical, not designed to reach some specific point. It was the question of someone who'd observed something they didn't fully understand and had the honesty to admit they didn't understand it. I thought about it for a moment before answering. I said, "It's not something you decide once, it's something you practice many times until it no longer requires effort." At first, I also cared what people thought. I also wanted to be seen, but over time I came to understand that the need to be seen comes from a place of insecurity, not strength, and that every time you seek external validation, you're giving someone else control over how you feel about yourself. Reuben listened in silence. I continued, "The day you understand that your worth doesn't depend on anyone recognizing it out loud, something changes. Not suddenly, slowly, but it changes. And after that change, being in a room where no one sees you doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like freedom. There was a silence, not uncomfortable, the kind silences have when something said needs a moment to settle before the conversation continues." Reuben nodded slowly. He said, "That's something I've got work to do on." He said it without drama, like an honest diagnosis, like someone who looks at an area of their life with clarity and names it without excuses or justifications. I said most people do. The difference is most people don't admit it. He smiled. A different smile from all the ones I'd seen that night in the restaurant, without calculation, without protocol, just a smile from someone who's being exactly who they are at that moment, and that, for some reason, feels good. We shook hands as we left, and this time a handshake was that of two people who know each other, not perfectly, not with the depth that time gives, but with that initial knowledge that is honest and has the possibility of growing into something real if circumstances allow it. When he left, I stayed for a moment in the empty meeting room. The folder with his revised projections was on the table, the numbers we'd worked on for 2 hours, the concrete possibility of a project that might work and might not, like all projects, but at least it started from an honest and well-built foundation. I thought about what I'd told him about the need to be seen, and I thought with a clarity that sometimes only comes after having said it out loud to another person, that I also had work to do in that area, that the silence I chose for years wasn't just strength, it was also, in part, a way to control who had access to what part of me a way to maintain power over my own narrative that deep down wasn't so different from the need for validation I described to Ruben. It was just the inverse version of the same problem. The difference between needing to be seen and needing not to be seen is smaller than it seems. Both come from the same place. Both are ways of giving control to something external. Real freedom is in the middle, in being able to be seen when the moment calls for it, and in being able not to be seen when the moment doesn't call for it, without either state costing you anything, without either defining who you are. That night at the restaurant, when Ruben forced me to speak, he gave me, unknowingly, something I hadn't sought but needed. Not the opportunity to prove anything, but the opportunity to let go of something, to let the truth occupy its rightful space without asking permission from any of my old fears. And that, more than anything else that had happened that night, was what remained with me. 3 months have passed since that night. Ruben's project is still under evaluation. The conversations continue with the seriousness they deserve, with the right steps and without haste. It may amount to something, it may not, but that's no longer the most important thing that happened that night. It never was. The most important thing happened in a car parked in front of a restaurant with light rain on the windshield and a woman beside me who asked me 2 simple questions that had been waiting 11 years to be asked. Maricella and I are the same as always. The same routine, the same comfortable morning silence, the same coffee I make on weekends because she says mine tastes better, though I think she says it more out of habit than real conviction. The same long conversations that start in the kitchen and end in bed without either of us remembering exactly how we got from one point to the other. But something's different, not on the surface, deep down, in that place where relationships have their real structure, the one you don't see but that you feel in every interaction, in every silence, in every moment when one chooses to stay when they could leave and the other knows it. Even if no one says it out loud. Now there are fewer compartments. That's all. Fewer areas where I decide alone what should be decided with her present. Not because she demanded it, but because that night I understood something I'd known in theory for years, but hadn't quite believed in practice, that sharing doesn't diminish. That letting someone into the parts you care for most doesn't make them more vulnerable. It makes them more real. And real things are more solid than protected things. There was a night, a few weeks after the dinner, when Maricella came home late from the studio with that specific expression she has when something worries her, but she doesn't want it to show. It took me a second to identify it, because for years I'd chosen not to pressure, not to ask more than she voluntarily offered, to respect her space in the same way I wanted mine to be respected. But that night I said, "What happened?" She looked at me with that expression that crosses a person's face when something unexpected happens exactly when they needed it. She told me about a problem with a contractor, a difficult decision about a project that had been months in the making and was at risk for reasons not entirely within her control. One of those situations where there's no perfect answer and any path has a cost. I listened without interrupting, without offering solutions before she finished. Just listening, which is the most difficult and most valuable thing you can do for someone who needs to be heard. When she finished, we were silent for a moment, and then I told her what I thought. Not as the husband trying to solve his wife's problem, but as someone who's made enough difficult decisions to know that sometimes clarity comes not from thinking more, but from saying it out loud in front of someone who listens without judging you. She considered what I said, nodded at some parts, dismissed others. She came to a conclusion on her own that I wouldn't have reached exactly the same way, but that had its own perfect logic. In the end, she said, "Thank you." I told her she didn't have to thank me for anything. She said, "I'm not thanking you for the solution. I'm thanking you for asking." That stuck with me because it was exactly what I needed to learn, that sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't an answer, but a question. It's not arriving with a solution, but creating the space where the other person can find alone. And that space isn't created with silence, but with active presence, with the simple question of what happened said at the right time with the right intention. I learned that late, but I learned it. I think about that night at the restaurant more often than I expected. Not about Ruben, not about the numbers, nor the silence at the table, nor the eyes that looked at me differently in the second half of dinner. I think about the moment before all that, about the first 90 minutes when I was invisible and didn't care to be, about the particular comfort of that place I'd built for myself for so many years. That place where no one expected anything from me, because no one knew there was anything to expect. It was comfortable, it was safe, it was completely mine, and it was also, to some extent, a way of hiding, not from others, but from myself, from the possibility that something I valued would be altered by coming into contact with another person's reality. From the particular vulnerability of showing what you care for most in front of someone who could theoretically change it just by knowing. The most sophisticated fear isn't the fear of failure. It's the fear that something good will break because it was exposed. And that fear, which seems like prudence when you look at it from the inside, is actually a form of not trusting, not others, but what you've built, the solidity of what you have. If something is real, it withstands being seen. If something is solid, it doesn't break because someone knows it. What Maricella and I had was real and solid. 11 years of evidence proved it, and I kept it in the dark anyway. Not because it needed darkness to survive, but because I needed to believe I needed it. That night, when Ruben forced me to be who I truly am, he didn't just expose something in front of a table of strangers. He exposed me to myself. He showed me, with the accidental precision that others' mistakes sometimes have, that the silence I'd chosen was no longer a strength. It was a habit. And habits, unlike strengths, don't protect you. They only limit you. There's one thing I tell people when they ask me in professional contexts how I assess risk. I tell them that the most expensive risk isn't the one you see and decide to take. It's the one you don't see because you confused it with security. It applies to markets. It applies to business. It applies, I discovered that night, to life too. I don't need anyone to know who I am. That's still true. Internal security doesn't depend on external validation, and that's not going to change because a man at a dinner learned an expensive lesson about how to treat people before knowing them. But there was one person who did need to know, just one, and for 11 years I had her by my side without giving it to her completely. That has changed now, and that change, small and invisible to any external observer, is the most valuable thing I took away from that night. Not Ruben's look when he understood who I was. Not the silence of the table, not the numbers, nor the project, nor the Thursday meeting, but getting home after all that, sitting in the kitchen with Maricella, telling her the complete truth for the first time, and discovering that 11 years after choosing her, I'd chosen well. That's what remains when the noise fades. That's the only thing that matters when the night ends and the room empties and those who are there to see you return to their lives and you return to yours. What you have when no one is watching anymore. And after that night, I finally had everything.